Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline Millsaps.
I'm Kaylee King.
And today we're going to be having a conversation about our three social locations that we discuss in our individual analyses. And so just as a reminder, this video is a video that meets the requirements for a course and it's for educational purposes only. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. We'll start with Kaylee. So in our 2018 Intercultural Communication class at East Tennessee State University, we discuss social locations or identities. We use those interchangeably. So thinking about these social locations, how would you describe yourself?
Okay, so I specifically looked at gender, religion, and socioeconomic status. So in terms of gender, I identify as a female. In terms of religion, I identify as a Christian, more specifically as a Church of God or a Pentecostal Christian. And then in terms of socioeconomic status, I do come from a lower income household. What about you, Caroline?
So I would describe myself, the three identities that I used for my paper were a Southern Appalachian female who was also a Christian. I do identify as Appalachian, even though technically I'm from Statesville, North Carolina, in Iredell County. And technically, Iredell County does not consider itself Appalachian, even though we're surrounded by Appalachian communities as identified by the ARC. And then I identify as female and Christian, specifically Southern Baptist.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that you're not technically from Appalachia, but you consider yourself Appalachian, whereas I'm from Cleveland, Tennessee, which is technically a part of Appalachia, but I've never considered myself Appalachian.
That's interesting. But do you consider yourself Southern? Do you identify Southern?
Yeah, I do identify as Southern, just not Appalachian.
Okay. So Kaylee, what do you see as like the historical representation of your identities?
Okay, so I feel like females are historically represented as weaker and as a weaker sex, basically, and whereas males are typically seen as more dominant and more strong.
Right.
I think that Christians are historically viewed as kind of arrogant, stuck up, very set in their ways, and if they don't get their way, or if somebody doesn't have the same opinions, then people always assume that we're just not willing to listen or willing to like meet them kind of halfway. And I think that people of low economic status are typically seen as like second class. And a lot of people view them as lazy and not hardworking, and they assume that it's their fault that they are low economic status. So, what about you, Karen?
So I feel like the historic representation, specifically with Appalachia, you can see like that constant like stigmatization, that everyone thinks that, Appalachians are, backwoods hicks, with little to no education, they're stubborn, meth head, moonshiner, that kind of thing. And you see these like constant like perpetuated stereotypes with those. I think that has like a historical, background to it. And then kind of like what you said, because I know we had two of the same identities. Gender is also, women are seen as, the weaker sex. And, the fact that, some women still aren't paid the same as men. And, women didn't get the right to vote till 1920. And then also, like, with Christians, people think you're, rude, stuck up, like a Bible-thumping bigot. And then also, like, kind of like with, like, the intersection of, like, religion and place, you can see, like, the historical representation, that people thought, like snakes handling in worship. So, that's a stereotype that people think that that's all Appalachia is.
All right, Caroline. Suppose someone from another planet visited Earth and asked you to describe your life as a female Southern Baptist Christian who is also Appalachian. What would you say?
I would say in terms of my three identities to being a female Southern Baptist Christian, I would say overall, like, it's a pretty good life. I can definitely see privilege, and I can definitely see oppressions like that I learned, by writing this paper. I feel as though, some people still see women as being like the weaker sex, and it's kind of like you're having to like prove yourself. And the same goes with like Appalachian, like being identifying as Appalachian, you have to like work like extra harder, to kind of like prove yourself to people. And then with a Christian, being a Christian, I feel like I've had, a good group of friends, so I can see that privilege. And, if, like, I'm having a bad day, like, I can, like, rely on my faith to kind of, like, pull me out of that.
Yeah.
What about you, Kaylee?
I agree with a lot of what you said. In terwhile I have faced oppressions, I think that I've also had it, easier than a lot of other females because I am tall and I do have a deeper voice, which are traits that are typically associated with masculinity. So I think that I've not been discriminated as much against. And then in terms of Christian, like you said, I have a really great group of friends because of that, and I can always rely on God no matter how bad it gets. And then in terms of low socioeconomic status, I think that's where I faced the most difficulties in life. But now that I'm independent and I have more control over it, I can kind of hide the fact that I am from a lower income household. And so I don't face as many discriminations now. All right. So on a daily basis, which identities are you most aware of? And please share an example.
I feel like the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear like question is like I think of my gender. Like I wake up every morning and I look in the mirror and I'm like, oh, you're a girl. And then I also have people calling me ma'am. Can I help you, ma'am? Holding doors. And just kind of helping you. If they see that you're struggling. So what about you, Kaylee? Which one's most salient to you?
I think for me it would be my religion, just because it's so ingrained in my daily life. And a lot of times I feel like the weight of the world is like on my shoulders, and that people rely on me a lot. Yeah, people rely on me a lot, and that if I don't do it, then it's not going to get done. And so I know at the end of the day that I can always count on God, and no matter what, it's going to be okay.
I agree with that. All right, so scholars advancing intersectionality contend that inequalities and the privileges that we face in relation to specifically our social locations, they reveal macro-level advantages and disadvantages. So, kind of going off on your social locations, can you describe some of your privileges and oppressions that you've faced?
So, I would say as a female, the biggest inequality that I face is being questioned more than males. So, I'm an SI leader, which is kind of like a tutor, and if a male SI leader doesn't know something, then he's told that it's okay and it's not that big of a deal. But if I don't know something, then I get questioned a lot, and I've heard people say well, why are you even an SI leader? But I think that there are also a lot of privileges that come with being a female, such as, I think that a lot of times females have more support, and I think that they're allowed to be more emotional, whereas males are typically told to suck it up and be a man. And then in terms of Christianity, I've not faced a ton of oppressions. I think the biggest inequality I faced is because I do identify as Pentecostal. A lot of times people, especially here, don't identify as Pentecostal as much, and so sometimes they don't understand it. There's a lot of misconceptions about that. And then there are a lot of privileges that come with being Christians, though, such as having great friends, and you can always find a church, because especially here in the South, there are tons of churches, tons of support groups, and you can always have a family, basically. And then I would say with socioeconomic status, the inequalities I faced typically were in high school, being made fun of, not having the same things that other kids have. But now that I'm in college, I can kind of hide that fact. And I think one of the biggest privileges is that I do get financial aid, something that I know people who don't have lower income families, they might have to take out loans and stuff like that. Right. What about you?
So going off on my three identities, excuse me. So female, an oppression would be some people still think that you're the weaker sex. I remember wanting to learn how to drive a manual transmission, and they were like, "Oh, you can't do that. You're a girl." But then being a woman, people see you as weaker, but then a lot of times they'll want to go out of the way to help you, and you have some people who put women upon a pedestal. In terms of being Appalachian, I think the privileges are, at least in my area, it's a very down home, kind of rooted community that you can always count on your neighbor. But as far as oppressions, I remember I went to Carnegie Hall. I actually sang in Carnegie Hall last May, and when we went to New York, obviously, we don't have the same accent, so people would stop me on the street, we'd strike up a conversation, and I would tell them why I was in New York, and it was almost you shouldn't be in New York to sing this classical piece of Latin music, it was they thought we were just a bunch of banjo players. And then as far as Christianity, I feel some people for oppression, I feel sometimes Christians are othered by non-Christians. So, you kind of get, like, again, people think you're, like a Bible thumping bigot, and you're just kind of set in your ways. But in terms of, like, privilege, unless I wear, like, a cross around my neck, like, no one's gonna know that I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
I don't wear, like, a hijab like a Muslim would. So if I'm walking down the street, no one's gonna, like, walk across the street to avoid me, whereas, like, if I identified as a Muslim, and wore a hijab, that might be different.
Yeah. Right. Those are some really good points. I agree with a lot of those.
Yeah, I agree with yours too.
Okay.
So what do you see as points of similarities across your social locations?
Okay, so I think that the biggest similarities I see are with gender and religion, because I think a lot of times in the church and society, women are still seen as, less than, and they're still not treated the same. So, what about you, Caroline?
That's true. Like we said before, we can see, like, privileges and oppressions, like, with both of them, so, that would be a similarity. But I did, like, I looked at, like, place and religion. So, like, these two, like, whenever they intersect, like, you look at, people think that Appalachians, are, like, snake handlers, like, in their religion, which is, true but just, like, for a very, like, small, population. And also, like, women viewed as, like, the weaker sex, like, specifically in Appalachia, they think that, like, women are, like, central to the home, and that's, like, the stereotype. And then Appalachians in general are, just viewed as weaker because of, like, the numerous health problems and, levels of poverty.
So imagine that you're talking to a child, your own, a relative or not. What do you say about the importance of understanding yourself in terms of being a female, being a Christian, and being Appalachian?
I would say, like, looking at my identities, I would tell them that it's important to learn about your identities because, we all have to be able to understand ourselves, before we can, go, understand others. And I feel like, especially this day and time, it's very important, you have to be, like, tolerant. And, we're all so different, but, we're all still the same. So you have to be able to, like, understand yourself, like, before you can go, understand others. So, and then also in terms of, being a female Appalachian who's also a Christian, you have to be able to look at all of your oppressions. So I think, like, if you look at how you're oppressed, then you can turn around and look and see, so you don't, like, simultaneously oppress others who identify, as these identities. So what about you, Kaylee?
I would say that no matter what your identities are, it's important for you to understand who you are and why you are who you are, because once you're solidified in your beliefs and you know that, then nobody can ever take that away from you. And no matter what anybody says, you can always say, this is who I am, and I'm proud of that.
That's true. That was good. That was deep. All right. So this concludes our conversation on our 3 identities with intersectionality. Thanks.